Hi everyone, my name is Dayan and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event for the Ryerson School of Interior Design's 2021 year-end show, Revisions Digital Design Festival. All of our sessions are offered with closed captioning in partnership with AI Media, so if you'd like to turn this on, all you have to do is click the live transcript button available at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you require ASL interpreter services, our provider is on standby as well. Please let them know in the Zoom chat if you require their services and make sure to pin David's screen. We will have our interpreter turn on their video now and wave to you to let you know who they are. We will be hosting many events over the 5 days between May 5th and the 9th, and we encourage you to visit our website, yesrsit.com, for our showcase highlighting student work from this past academic year. We will be launching new projects daily, so check it out. All projects will be viewable for the entirety of the month of May. Today, we are launching second year projects. Now we will hand over things to Laura, who will be presenting our land acknowledgement today.
Thank you, Dan. We want to begin this event by honoring that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which this university is located. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat since time immemorial. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. Settlers have not upheld this treaty, and Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island continue to resist settler colonial genocide at present day. Settlers, our responsibility is to honor the Dish with One Spoon territory and seek out ways in which we can act as accomplices in the resistance of settler colonial genocide. I want to close this opening with a call to action that I will also personally follow. On July 19th, 2020, the land defenders of 1492 Landback Lane stopped the housing development project of Mackenzie Meadows, bordering the town of Caledonia and Six Nations. Land defenders have been protecting 1492 Landback Lane for over 292 days now. If you don't already, follow them on social media to see their current needs for supplies and visit their GoFundMe, which I will post in the chat. Thank you, and back over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Laura. Next, I would like to give a statement in regards to anti-racism from the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Racist comments and racist acts, no matter how subtle, can no longer be ignored or tolerated in Canada. We must make the effort to be actively anti-racist, to call out inequality, and to challenge prejudice and bigotry, even when it does not affect us. Even the most subtle forms of racism contribute to the conditions that permit overt racism and violence to occur. Now it is a time for all Canadians, but especially non-racialized Canadians, to listen, learn, and reflect on how white privilege and systemic racism contribute to injustice and inequality in this country. We need to look inwards and have the courage to challenge our biases, fears, assumptions, and privileges. We need the courage to have difficult and uncomfortable conversations and to take action. We also want to recognize that if this is the first time you are hearing a land acknowledgement or an anti-racism statement, and if it doesn't mean anything to you quite yet, that's okay. Us saying these pieces are really just the first step. We encourage you to do your own research and reflection and to discover what these acknowledgements and statements might mean to you. And lastly, Revision aims to promote local businesses and bring awareness to our community charities. Each day, we will be featuring local businesses and charities that you can support. Today's first feature is Raven Reads. Raven Reads is a Canadian seasonal subscription service that features quality, award-winning Indigenous content and products curated by Indigenous authors and entrepreneurs across North America. Our next local business feature is Cheekbone Beauty. Cheekbone Beauty is an Indigenous-owned and founded digitally native Canadian cosmetic company established in 2016 by Jennifer Harper. They are constantly helping Indigenous youth see themselves in beauty brand and hoping to inspire many. And now we would like to give a shout out to ArtsCan, our charity for today. ArtsCan opens up pathways for opportunities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis youth to collaborate with artists, access instruments and artistic tools, and share their stories through creative expression. We would love for you to all to check out our social media for more information on how you can give your support. We have linked our community support page into the chat, so please be sure to check it out. Before we get started, I would like to share a few Zoom housekeeping tips so we are mindful of security concerns while using this platform. If there are any major disruptions that interrupt the host's ability to keep control of the Zoom platform, we will be asking everyone to log off immediately. We encourage respectful dialogue in the Zoom function at all times, and we absolutely encourage you to ask as many questions as you would like during today's session. To do this, you are going to be using the Q&A pod located at the bottom of your screen. You may rearrange your screen in any way that works best for you, and please note that rearranging your screen does not affect the ways in which others are viewing this presentation. Now I'll be passing things off to Laura Heidenheim, who is a member of the Ryerson School staff and will be introducing our panelists and guiding the discussions out from here. To introduce, Laura Heidenheim is a settler of mixed European and German Jewish ancestry, born and raised in London, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and Delaware peoples. For the past 4 years, she has been learning from and working with missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit family members, engaging in grassroots projects. Laura is one of the co-creators of Shades of Our Sisters, an exhibit which exists with the purpose of honoring MMIWG2S+ and giving families space to celebrate the lives of their loved ones. She is currently the manager of the Saga Jiwe, FCAD's Interdisciplinary Center for Indigenous Research and Creation. Now I'll be passing things off to Laura. You can take it away now.
Awesome, thank you. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker joining us for our Indigenous Design keynote presentation today, Chris Cornelius from Studio Indigenous. Chris Cornelius is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and associate professor of architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He is the founding principal of Studio Indigenous, a design practice serving Indigenous clients. Chris was a collaborating designer with Antoine Friedak at the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. Chris is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the inaugural Miller Prize from Exhibit Columbus, a 2018 Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award, and an artist residency from the National Museum of the American Indian. Chris has been exhibited widely, including at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. During the spring of 2021 semester, Chris is the Louis I. Kahn Visiting Assistant Professor at Yale University. Welcome, Chris. Yawako, for giving us your valuable time and joining us today.
Thank you, Laura. Wat kufnuela du, Chris Neon gets, aquahoni wagita loda, okele oniata aga nwagadon choda. So I said in Oneida that I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. So today I'm going to show you not only my work, but how I think about Indigenous design and how I integrate my culture into that design, and how I think about putting things into the world as a designer and the responsibilities of that. So one of the aspects about indigeneity that I think is really important to think about, and I think about a lot, is this idea of relationality, that we're all related, right? That we're related to our not only humans, but to non-humans. In indigeneity, we think of even stones as having life, and they're part of our sort of way of living. And that relationality is expressed through familial terms. The earth is our mother, the moon is our grandmother. And I think that if we started to think about architecture in the same way, if we thought about buildings as if we were related to them, we would think about the responsibilities of putting them into the world, and how we begin to do that. So I'll share with you three basic themes that are kind of run through my work. And the first is the idea that design is ceremony, and ceremony is, for me, it's a responsibility, right? That it is full of rituals. It is, I'm thinking about how I am putting physical things into the landscape and all of the effects of putting those things into the landscape. How would we begin to think about how we put buildings, architecture, installations, other built objects into the world, into being? And for me, it's not just about being on rural or reserve land. It's also about cities. Cities are living things as well. And so how do we begin to think about putting those things into the world? So the first project I'll share with you is the Miller Prize installation. I was one of 10 designers in the US that was selected to compete for 5 prizes, the 5 Miller Prizes on 5 different sites. And so it was basically a kind of head-to-head competition. We were assigned the sites, and then our who we were competing against was also assigned to us. And so this is in Columbus, Indiana. And if you don't know the story about Columbus, Indiana, you should research it, but it's really an amazing place. So the site that I got is First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen, who is also working with his son, Eero Saarinen. It's the first modernist church in the U.S., and Columbus, Indiana has a number of modernist works. There's an IMP library, was one of his first projects across the street, and Eero Saarinen did a number of houses in there. But my project is called Wikiami, which is the Miamia word for wigwam, and is the Miamia or Miami people that were indigenous to this landscape. And so I wanted to raise awareness of that in this particular project, so that people understood that there were others here before it was a city. And Indiana is one of these places in the U.S. that history got erased very quickly, and it's not easy to kind of find that information. And so I wanted people to be aware of that. And so this piece is basically a physical land acknowledgement of that. And because of the exhibition was originally 3 months, but my piece stayed there for almost 2 years, and people at the church were happy with having it on the site. I was very fortunate that the people of Columbus embraced it and really celebrated its existence there. But for me, I wanted to not duplicate the form of the wigwam, but to be able to reinterpret the constituent parts of it, the frame, the exterior cladding. And so the cladding here is an expanded steel. The frame is steel rebar that's welded together, and so the cladding, I call its feathers. And for me, I think of it as an animal. It existed in this landscape, and it was a living thing that lived and breathed there. It slept at night. There wasn't any kind of lighting on the thing, and people used it in different ways. The library used it for storytelling. There was a native code talker ceremony within it. There was a dance company that choreographed a piece around it. And so it was a part of the life of the city of Columbus for almost 2 years. And so that project, the Exhibit Columbus, is that was its first iteration, and they're actually going to start their third iteration this summer. And the piece sits in the corner in this sort of dense canopy of trees. And so I wanted it to extend into that canopy. And I wanted it to be able to have a conversation with the Saarinen Tower, which is an enormous landmark. It's really quite an extraordinary piece, the bell tower that goes along with the church. And could these two pieces of architecture begin to communicate with one another? Could there be a way of understanding Indigenous values and communicating those to the church? Another installation that I built, I got a residency from a place called Bookworm Gardens, which is in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just 45 minutes north of Milwaukee, where I am. This particular piece won the Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award for Best Temporary Installation in 2018. And in my proposal, I wrote that I wanted to build an installation that was based on the trickster in Indigenous storytelling. And that this idea of the trickster is usually an animal. Sometimes it's some other sort of phenomena, but the trickster is really important in these stories because it tells us about our own humanity. It tells us about gluttony and greed and vanity, those kinds of things. And usually in the stories, they are we get the lessons of what happens when you do those kinds of things, right? And so for me, I wanted it to kind of defy program and form, and for it to be a different kind of thing within this landscape. And I built it out of trees that were harvested on the site. And I used a copper mesh to enclose it. So it doesn't have a particular use, meaning it's not a pavilion or some other sort of thing. And I wanted the children that come to this garden to be able to tell their stories about the thing. And it did start to happen. I happened upon a girl who was watching it as I was building it. And she raised this issue that she thought it was built by animals and humans came later. And so for me, I was thinking that she really understood and got what I was trying to do with the piece. And so it also has regalia on it. And I think that architecture can have regalia. It's loosely based on this model on the left. I use the same copper mesh that I used on the model on the actual piece. But I started to think about the idea and notion of regalia, Indigenous regalia, because it's more than just aesthetic. It's kind of hyper ornament. It tells you you're standing in the world and you know where you belong and who people can understand that. So on the right is Gastoe from the Haudenosaunee, and because my people, the Oneida, are also part of that confederacy. We understand that when we see this Gastoe, we know which nation the wearer belongs to. And so we know that this is Mohawk because it's 3 feathers up. In Oneida, it's 2 feathers up, 1 feather down. We also know that this is a chief because of the antlers. So in that way, it starts to signal these other sorts of things. And I started to think in exploring in these models, could architecture have regalia, and could I begin to put regalia on it? And so this is a film that was made of the piece in the winter of 2019 while it was still in the garden. So the filmmakers, Spirit of Space, are friends of mine. I didn't really tell them how to film this thing. They just said that they wanted to film it in the snow. And one of the wonderful things about the way that they make films, I think they're excellent storytellers. And they started to reveal things to me. I didn't think about the regalia having a correspondence with the pine needles. I also like how they filmed it as if it were an animal that if you got too close to it, you might scare it. And so another thing that I want to share about how I began to think about my own architectural education, me as an educator in teaching non-Indigenous content, how we begin to see and teach architecture, I think we should begin to think about that. And so this image on the right, we often show in architectural history courses, the Loget's frontispiece about the beginnings of architecture. And it's really important to understand the relationship here between the architect and nature and what is being communicated in an image like this. And then on the left, I oppose that with what Indigenous architecture is, that the relationship between nature and architecture is very close. It's almost seamless in a way. And so the differences here for me are nature is a commodity for you to consume, almost like a raw material that you have dominion over and use to in the service of architecture. And on the left, it's a relationship again, right? This idea that we're related to nature, we're related to our non-human relatives as well, all the animals and other sorts of non-human entities that are in the world. And for me, the real sort of basic difference between these two things is that the notion that nature is mine to possess and to use, and nature is me, that I'm actually part of that relationship. And so in this idea of design as ceremony, to begin to think about that relationship, I'm thinking about that relationship when I'm designing things and beginning to think about how I'm putting things into the world. And I think we all should begin to think about that. I also think that we should think of buildings as our youngest relatives. They need the most sort of care, right? They need care when we're putting them into the world. If we really think about it, they breathe, they sweat, they produce waste. We have to think about how we're putting these things into the landscape and the materials that are used, people that are producing those materials, people that are installing those materials, and along with the people that will use it throughout its life. Another piece that I'm currently working on at Lawrence University, which is a private college here in Wisconsin, they wanted an Indigenous land acknowledgement similar to Wikiami, and so I've named this piece Otiche, which is crane in the Menominee language, and so it's the Menominee people that were indigenous to this particular landscape, most of Wisconsin. And one of the things that distinguish Menominee people that I've always found fascinating is that when we begin to look at the art of Indigenous people, what we'll often see is a reflection of nature. Right. And it's how people see that nature and how they begin to express that. So one of the things that the Menominee people do, they use these sort of geometric patterns that are an abstraction of nature and things that they see. Trees are really important to Menominee people. And so you'll often see that theme or motif in their work. When you look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, you can actually see the Menominee Nation. It is this rectangle right here in the middle. It almost looks like it's photoshopped onto the satellite photo. And the reason it's like that is because that forest is so dense. That's actually where the reservation boundary is. People occupied a good portion of the eastern part of the state, but that's where the reservation boundary is. They've always sustainably harvested their forest. Their standards are higher than the FSC in the US. And while they were a part of that organization to begin with, they've left that organization because their standards weren't as stringent. And so they see trees as relatives. And so when they're brought down, it's a ceremony, and those trees are giving their lives to the world. And I think it's really important to begin to understand that. And so the location of the college is this far away, but this is the reservation boundary. And so I'm using the piece to acknowledge that, so to begin that, so that people understand whose land that they're on. And so this dark shape here is the figure that is basically the boundary of where the Menominee people were indigenous to Wisconsin. And so from the top, the piece itself points towards that reservation and acknowledges that, and to begin to acknowledge that. It's made out of weathering steel with a custom perforation. The pattern we used is one that was developed from that geometric sort of patterning of nature. And so that when you're surrounded by this thing, you're surrounded by this patterning of nature and different ways that light can come into it. You can step into the piece to begin to observe the sky and think about the ways that this thing connects to other places. And because it's the crane in the Menominee Nation is one of their clans. And in that clan, the crane have responsibility for art and architecture. And so for me, it was appropriate. So to name it that. I didn't try to make an abstract thing look like a crane, for instance. I just wanted, the name actually came after the design of the piece. The design of the piece is really about that sort of geometric pattern and what begins to happen when I extrude that pattern or begin to loft surfaces between them. And then the cladding on it, again, is like an animal, like feathers, like fish scales, thinking about how this thing is clad in this way. And so it sits in this plaza on the university, a main sort of public area that's within that university. And this piece is about to start fabrication and will be installed this summer. A second theme that I want to share with you is the idea that drawing is medicine. And so when we think about and express things as medicine and indigeneity, it is about how it makes us feel, makes us better, both our mind, body, and spirit. For me, drawing is that thing. And drawing is one of those rituals that is part of the ceremony of design. I often draw speculative things in my sketchbooks. Those things become projects sometimes, but other times they're just, I'm thinking about things. I think that inspiration finds you working. I try to get over this idea of staring at the blank page. I don't erase anything. I haven't erased anything in my sketchbooks. I believe that we draw how we think, meaning like when we start thinking and drawing, we might draw lightly, right? And then as things come into our mind, we start to color them in, or I start to use watercolors and other sorts of things. And I think that intensity in the drawing is really important. And so for me, it's part of my process and that drawing. And so it's also part of the way that I teach. I teach representation and at the undergrad and graduate levels. And when I teach design studios, drawing is always a part of the work. And so the last theme that I'll leave you with is this idea of decolonization. And decolonization really is about the land dispossession of people that are indigenous to the US and Canada. And true decolonization is giving that land back, right? That this dispossession being reversed and thinking about that. But I think of decolonization, I think of colonization rather, as a system or apparatus that needs to be dismantled. And for me, I want to dismantle that from within. And it's not about using the master's tools against the master. It's really about the master teaching me how to make my own tools and what are the tools that I'm going to use to dismantle that system. I think that I have to do that from within it. I don't think it's enough to critique it from the outside, to be a part of it, to be a part of academia, to be a part of the design professions. That's what's important to me, and to begin to dismantle that and look at all of the ways that design has fostered and helped colonization throughout time. And so in Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodology, she's talking about research in Indigenous communities. And she has what she calls the vocabulary of colonialism. And so I borrow these terms and really think about the terms that she's brought forth and what colonialism actually is, right? So the first is the line, the map, the survey, the territory, to say this country or this state, and to begin to outline that thing and to draw these lines and boundaries. The second is this idea of the center, the orientation, the system of power, right? The establishment of the capital, or putting a church in the middle, that everything is oriented in that, right? The center may be the geometric center, but it's this idea that there's a central sort of part or portion to things. And the last thing is the outside, right? That the territory or people are in oppositional relation to the center. Build a wall, keep them out. We're inside, you're outside, us and them, like all of those kinds of ways of thinking. And so the ways to begin to decolonize, the ways that we design and think and draw and make, is to be aware of these things and when they're happening. The other thing that you'll notice, and I talk about them a lot as an architectural professor, that these are architectural acts. These can be architectural acts in the ways that we think, the ways that we draw, the ways that we make and teach, and begin to think about that. So how could we rethink the ways that we're using those tools, that there are other ways to use these tools? Can we use those tools and develop other ways to dismantle the system, to begin to think about the definitions of these things, right? It's not necessarily in the thing itself, but it's in the definition and how these things get used. And so I think that colonialism is fueled by a lack of empathy, right? It is the one thing that it feeds off of. It is the one thing that perpetuates it. And so in the design disciplines, the more empathetic we can be to one another, to understand that we got to the places that we're at right now in different ways, that there are other people, that the ways that we examine design problems and design solutions are really about how people interact, both people and non-humans, right? To begin to think about the empathy of non-humans. As architects, we spend a lot of, there's a lot of energy spent, I shouldn't say we because I don't do it, but there's a lot of energy spent, for instance, keep birds off of buildings. Why aren't we making buildings that are also habitats for our non-human relatives, right? How could we begin to think about, what if we began to think about the houselessness problem in our countries? And what if our buildings actually did create these kinds of habitats? What if we started if each of us started to think about small ways that we could build this empathy, it is a way to begin to dismantle the system of colonialism. And so for me, and these projects, this is a project that's an ongoing research project for me, and examining the indigenous occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November 1969 to June of 71. It's when Alcatraz was decommissioned as a prison, was in the federal land surplus. But in this project, I'm thinking and drawing in a different way. I'm trying to almost decolonize the line. I'm beginning to think about lines not actually meaning things that separate, right? And when we draw a line in a plan, it might be a wall, it might be a seam in a material, but how can we begin to think about, can a line be more than that, right? And so for me, when these things come into my mind, I put them into the drawing. I also think that as designers, we should cognitively use other parts of our brains. And so for me, I think that we should be thinking about this as a design curriculum. Could we begin to think about these three things, that the idea that design is ceremony, drawing is medicine, and decolonization as a system for ways of teaching young designers. And for me, it's the way that I practice and the ways that I begin to think about how I'm putting things in the world and my responsibility as a designer to do that. Yeah, welcome. Thank you.
Yawako, thank you so much, Chris. So we're at the part of this presentation where we're looking for questions from folks. So please, if you haven't already, there's a Q&A at the bottom. But I maybe I don't see any there yet, so maybe I'll start with one that I had. I know we have a lot of students in the audience today, particularly students in their final year, and I've heard you in other lectures speak about the responsibility that designers have. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that responsibility, particularly for our graduating students who are entering into the field.
Yeah, I think we all have responsibility, whether we're a professional, we're a student, we're a professor, wherever we are in the design disciplines, we certainly have responsibility. It's just about being cognizant of the design decisions that we make, right? There are thousands of decisions that we can make, especially when you're designing a building or a project, right? How can I affect each of those decisions in what ways? True decolonization, I think, is virtually impossible, like at 100%. But could we begin to think about this empathetic notion, right? To begin to think about other people. And I think, in architecture schools, we should be thinking about what we're making and how we administer those things. So architecture school and the sort of way that we've been teaching architecture for like 150 years is one where we're very good at teaching you the what's and the how, right? Like this project and how are you going to execute that? The things that we don't do very well is teach you the who and the why. For who, to whom is this thing going to exist, and who is it relating to, and why would we be putting this thing in wherever we are putting it, right? The sort of design responsibility. So I think that it's for us to begin to think about the material decisions we make, the design decisions we make, how we interact with one another, and how we begin to think with and how are we citizens in the world. It's really about that kind of responsibility that we have as designers. And when we think about it, it's really quite amazing. And it's always been the thing that fascinates me about architecture, is that we can conceive something, people build it and exist within it, right? And that thing came from your mind. And so it's in that responsibility of thinking about the built world that we can begin to interact with our relatives, meaning both human and non-human, and how can these buildings interact with one another, buildings, installations, whatever it is that we're designing and putting into the landscape.
Thank you. Yeah, and I've loved hearing you speak too about understanding the designs that we create as our youngest relations and having to care for them. Thank you. Some questions are coming in. One person has asked, what challenges have you faced as an Indigenous designer, and how has that affected your work?
I mean, it's just challenging to be an Indigenous person in every aspect. As a designer, as a citizen, I can't even start to talk about all of the challenges. I think that for a long time, my work really wasn't regarded as being relevant in some ways, right? I also think that the discipline didn't know how to think about it or judge it or assess it, and those things are changing. And so, I mean, there's just really a lot of challenges in being Indigenous. I think one of the biggest challenges, however, is that we don't normally think about our own culture, right? As human beings, we don't examine it. We don't like think about it. We don't scrutinize it. We don't sort of think about it in intellectual ways, but I have to, right? As a designer, I kind of have to do that. So that, to be honest, can get cumbersome sometimes. I don't always want to examine who I am and where I belong and where I came from, and the trauma associated with that, or the dispossession of land, and all of these other sorts of things that go along with being Indigenous. And so there are just tons of ways of challenges of being Indigenous in this profession that I've had to face. So.
And perhaps along that same vein, I've got a few questions in here, and this is a big one about appropriation. And I think there's some young designers in the audience asking how, as non-Indigenous designers, how they can walk that line of ensuring that they're not appropriating Indigenous knowledges.
I mean, this is really a tough one, to be honest, and it's I don't have a recipe for it, meaning like I can't tell you what the formula is. It's kind of a thing, you know it when you see it. And so I have this issue. I've been thinking about it a long time, right? So I'm teaching a studio at Yale right now. We just had our final review yesterday. 10 advanced grad students, none of them are Indigenous, and I'm teaching them Indigenous ways of thinking about design. And that question comes up. These students are very bright, and they're very concerned about this issue of appropriation. If I could draw an analogy, it would be like in the fashion world, for instance, if an Indigenous design pattern or motif is used and it's not an Indigenous designer, that is appropriation, right? That if a non-Indigenous designer is basically taking these things and just applying them to their work. I think the same thing can happen in design and architecture when we're taking Indigenous things and we're applying it to our work. If we're using Indigenous thinking and thought, which is a different way of thinking about it, and you're making it your own, right? And so we're having, in my studio, we've talked a lot about this semester about Indigenous epistemology, Indigenous ontology, Indigenous axiology, and beginning to think about ways of thinking, Indigenous knowledge, how it's applied, what is important and not important in indigeneity, and how can you apply those to your own life. That's where I think that we cross this line from appropriation to being appropriate. And I believe that Indigenous knowledge is actually for everyone because it is about how we relate to each other. But it's not, it has different resonance and it has different ways of being applied by Indigenous people. So Indigenous architecture comes from Indigenous people. Architecture for Indigenous people is different, and that comes from non-Indigenous designers. It's a tricky line, to be honest, to think about. But I always kind of go back to that issue of like when the fashion world has done that, this kind of appropriation, and then they're probably still guilty of it. But that's the sort of analogy that I would draw. If someone mistakes it for being Indigenous and it's not created by Indigenous people, that's a kind of appropriation.
Thank you. Perhaps we have one more question that came in, and I'll ask you that, and then I'll send it back over to the team. But someone's asking, and this is another big, we're hitting you with some big questions in your last few minutes. Someone's asking, what characteristics of Indigenous design are most important to you and why?
I think the first thing you have to realize about Indigenous design is that it is not a style, it is not a type, it is not a thing. Right? It's not like other movements in art, in architecture, even in music. It's not a subgenre. It's not a genre. It's none of those things. It's none of those things. So you have to understand when you're thinking about it to think about that first. It is a way of thinking. It is a way of being. It is a way of doing, right? And by Indigenous people, primarily, right? Number one, I think that's important. And so for me, the things that I think about a lot are these ideas of relationality. How can I begin to think about what I'm making as a relation, and how am I thinking about what I'm designing and how it relates to my non-human relatives. So the Indian Community School has been a client of mine for 18 years now. I've been ever since I've established my practice, and they're still a client. And one of the things I'm currently working on with them is a master plan for their entire sort of land base and campus, which is over 200 acres. We're trying to write this thing in a way that is about Indigenous thinking. So it's less about like, you should do this and you shouldn't do that, and more about this is what you should think about when you're doing this, right? You should be thinking about habitats, your non-human relatives, whether you're using pesticides or you're not using pesticides, where prairie burns should happen and where they shouldn't happen, like all of these things that are incorporated into the thing. So relationality is one of those things. The other for me that's really, I think, intertwined, and I kind of can't separate the epistemology, ontology, and axiology, but this idea of Indigenous knowledge and the Indigenous way of thinking. So storytelling is really important to me as well. I think that architecture can tell stories. I think that we can tell stories in architecture. I think that we could begin to use it as a device, and we can write our own stories about architecture. In that way, it's not really about appropriation. It would be appropriation if I used a very specific story, and like if I used a story. So it's one of the things that when I work with other nations other than my own, I always like to start with the creation story. Tell me the creation story that your people tell, because it reveals so much about how they live in the landscape, how they think about the world, what is important. Is it about the sky? Is it about the earth? Is it about water? Is it about all of those things? Is it about cultivating the land? Is it about hunting? Like all of these things begin to reveal themselves in that. So the storytelling is for me is the really kind of the second part of that. And like most things in indigeneity, you can't really isolate them, right? These things can't be isolated. I think that the epistemology, ontology, axiology are all intertwined in a very important relationship of reciprocities that we can't just like isolate these things and treat them in this way. So when I talk about Indigenous design, there isn't a recipe for it, right? There isn't a sort of formula to say, well, this is what you do in Indigenous design. And it's really sort of interesting that when I speak to other Indigenous designers, other Indigenous architects, like the ones that was in the Venice Biennale with, we all approach it from a different perspective, and we all have our own perspectives, and we're all different designers. We all sort of work in different ways, but we're all trying to do a similar thing. We're trying to bring indigeneity into the built world, into experience, into material, into ways of thinking and seeing the world through our built environment, not just through people, but people are important as inhabitants of those things, but seeing architecture as a contemporary cultural artifact is really kind of what we're trying to do.
Yawako, thank you so much, Chris. This has been an incredible event, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. And so I'll turn things back over to the YES team to finish up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. I just want to take the time to thank Chris again for not only joining our event, but also starting such interesting conversations around subjects that I think are so important, especially in today's sociopolitical standings. And Chris, I also want to thank you for showing us your beautiful sketches. They were honestly so inspiring, and it's really interesting to see the ways in which that different designers approach design. So thank you so much for such an informational and educational session today. I'd also really like to thank Laura for joining us and leading this interesting discussion, and also to thank our ASL interpreter, David, for joining us this afternoon as well. I just want to give a thanks and send my gratitude to everyone and who's put in their effort and dedication to making this event possible. We hope that everyone enjoyed today's Indigenous design panel. I would love for everyone to stay connected and see what other events that we have coming up this week. The next event that we do have today is the Intersectionality in Design Table Talk at 5 p.m. So please be sure to check that out. Also make sure to look at our website to look at the student showcase work again, and our event schedule is posted on our Instagram at YesArcid. So be sure to go there to support the charities and local businesses as well that is being posted down below. I hope you guys all stay safe and take good care of yourselves. Thank you for joining again, and goodbye.